So moving on, our speaker, Bill Pollard. You heard the name, and Bill's a very recognizable face around the East Side. It's really a pleasure. Bill's had a long, successful career in, I'll say, commercial real estate. He might change that a little bit when he describes it, but in 2009, Bill co-founded a company called Talon Private Capital. And you always hear in the newspaper, on the media, private equity this and private equity that. Well, private equity is nothing more than a group of private investors, institutional, or people that choose to pick a niche. Bill's niche happens to be real estate up and down the West Coast. Again, you can correct me on that, Bill, but he's got projects. If you go on their website, very impressive, the projects that Talon has been involved with. Many of them local, that you may not even think of, that are kind of behind the scenes. Bill is a really active member in a local community. He was past president of the Washington chapter of NAIOP, which is a big commercial real estate organization, and he's been on the board of the Bellevue Chamber, and the Bellevue Downtown Association, and the Bellevue Schools Foundation. So he's a graduate of Lewis and Clark in the mid-'80s, and he lives here locally with his wife and 2 kids. So it's really a pleasure to have Bill Pollard as our speaker. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, everybody. This is like old and only. This is pretty fun. When I was on the board years ago, we didn't serve lunches like this. The chamber had, Gary, thank you for doing what you're doing, giving leadership. It's a lot of responsibility. And Dwight, thank you. Appreciate it very much. Columbia Bank is a large tenant of ours, actually. So my marketing people tell me I'm supposed to call our project the new Belfield Office Park. We own Belfield Office Park down on Southeast State Street, and Columbia Bank is one of our new premier tenants in the project. So thank you for a lot of support. So commercial real estate. Let me try to make this somewhat interesting, and I'll go backwards a little bit, and then we'll try to spend most of our time going forward and talking about going forward. The first thing, if I could, most of the maybe in the room may know this, but let me just give you a little orientation, kind of real estate 101 relative to the 2 different forces that are at work constantly in the real estate market. You have 2 cycles that are constantly running that are independent of each other, but ultimately very related to each other. One is the capital market cycle. So capital, equity, debt, wanting to invest in investments around the world, choosing among 20 asset classes to put their money into, one of them being commercial real estate. And so at any given moment in time, the debt and equity markets, global debt and equity markets, are evaluating commercial real estate on a risk-adjusted basis and deciding, based on the returns that the market is generating in various parts of the world, how much equity and how much debt to make available into commercial real estate. So that's important because there's certain things that require equity and debt. You can't buy buildings without it. You can't build buildings without it. It gets hard to sell buildings if no one has any money to pay you for them. So you've got to be kind of cognizant of what's going on that cycle. And the world doesn't really care about the dynamics of your little market in Seattle, Washington, or Bellevue, Washington. It's going to tell you whether there's capital available or not. Then over here, we have Bellevue. And we have all the fundamentals of Seattle and Bellevue going on. We have the in-migration of people coming into the marketplace. We have job growth. We have all this great activity that goes on here. And so supply and demand of office space kind of is constantly in flux. At the moment, as you well know, we've had a huge run-up in demand. There's been a finite amount of supply over the last, in both Seattle and Bellevue, for the last 5 to 7 years. People haven't been building buildings up until very recently, but yet jobs have been coming in, companies have been growing, so as a result, rents have been going up, vacancies have been going down in Bellevue and Seattle. Now those rents have gotten to a level where someone can build a building and justify building it and get a return on it. At that same moment in time, they look back at the capital market cycle and they go, is there capital available to do it? And it turns out there's lots of capital that wants to be in commercial real estate. Turns out the interest rates are dirt low, so there's lots of debt available for commercial real estate. So we're at that moment in time where there's kind of perfect scenario, perfect world. You know, anytime it's too perfect, it might be too perfect. There might be something looming on the horizon. But again, as you think about commercial real estate, I would encourage you to not focus on. A lot of people will look on vacancy rates or rental rates, but you really got to be kind of cognizant of both of those things, because they can, when they are askew of each other, it's a very difficult market to be in, regardless of whether you're a tenant or whether you're an investor. So that's kind of macro dynamics as you evaluate commercial real estate. In Seattle, maybe the first slide, and I'm not going to spend a lot of emphasis. Oh, do I have the clicker? Sorry. I have the clicker. I think Dan taught me how to do this, and I didn't do it properly. No. Oh, there we go. Sorry. So this is just a slide I stole from some friends of mine at Jones Lang LaSalle. I would focus on the red. So this ranks Seattle overall 8th best real estate market in the nation. But investments, which is the red portion, we're actually, I think, number 3 in the nation. So if you said every investment dollar, debt or equity, that wants to go into the United States real estate markets, Seattle is the 3rd most popular place to put your money. When I say Seattle, I talk about Seattle and Bellevue. The other thing is jobs are basically back or slightly above where they were at the peak. So employment is high as it's ever been, and growing. And there's a lot of capital that wants to be in the greater Seattle, Bellevue marketplaces. Again, I'm kind of cursing through this quickly because I want to get to maybe what might be more interesting to you. This is a little clock that, again, Jones Lang LaSalle produces, but it basically shows you a cycle, and it shows you where they believe we are in the cycle. And you can see on the bottom, it's the Bellevue Central Business District. Red means it's a good landlord market. White means it's a good tenant market. And you can see where the greater Puget Sound area is. So based on when this was completed at the end of 2014, it's a landlord market. If we're in the whatever that might be, 6th inning of 7th inning, and we're climbing towards the peak at some point in the future. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Rents are basically where the highest level that they've ever been. They're at new construction levels. You know, commercial real estate, particularly in markets like Seattle, Bellevue, is kind of interesting because rents could drop for a whole bunch of reasons, lack of demand, oversupply, and then rents can come up, but as soon as they get to that moment in time where you can justify building a new building, there's 10 guys like me going, oh, time to build a building. So all of a sudden that creates a ceiling on where rent growth can go, because there's no reason that rents need to go higher because supply starts to kick in. Now there's lags between those two things, so there's artificial moments in time where you might have higher rents than you might think you would have, but then supply catches up. Rents might go down a little bit because you have oversupply momentarily, but generally rents hover, as you can see over this horizon, generally they're going to hover in that $40 per square foot range at the peaks. All right, let me talk about, and then this just gives you a glimpse. Black is occupied, red is vacant. This is the skyline of Bellevue. So you can see that there's very little vacancy in Bellevue. So I look at this and it makes me think of a couple of things. We have a handful of companies that have been historically the drivers of office space in the greater Bellevue area. And I don't know if it's my next slide, we'll find out. No, I'm gonna come right there. Those are some of the names, Greater East Side, that you see over and over again, and it has historically been the groups that have driven growth in our marketplaces. And as we enter this period of new supply beginning to come into the market with the evolution of the new construction projects underway, with the vacation of some tenants that are leaving Bellevue, Expedia being the most well-known one, the pullback, Microsoft's pending pullback in Bellevue of some space. It's going to question. The question is clearly going to be on the lips of a lot of people in real estate: is where the demand is going to come from to maintain the level of occupancy, maintain the level of rents, or in fact, are we not going to be able to keep up with the supply that's pending? Give you a macro thought. We have 10 million square feet in the downtown area, downtown marketplace of office space. We have 35 million square feet in the total east side of office space. So of the 10 million square feet, there's 1.5 million square feet under construction. And there's another 500 to 700,000 of give back space likely coming into the market from tenants leaving. So call it 2 million feet of new supply in a 10 million square foot downtown market, or a 35 million square foot broader market. Doesn't feel that out of whack. Feels kind of appropriate for the size of the marketplace. It feels appropriately kind of restrained relative to the demand. But the problem is those companies at the moment aren't demonstrating a likelihood of increasing or coming into the Bellevue core and absorbing most of the space. And so it's causing some concern among people. I would tell you that all those companies are currently in Seattle, are in Bellevue or Kirkland or nearby. They're all growing. They're all in the market looking for more space. And that is the future of the tenancy of this marketplace. We love the previous big boys. They're great. They've done wonderful things for our community. They've been great pillars of the commercial real estate industry. But the reality is Bellevue is evolving, and Bellevue is going to become a much more diverse, tech-centric marketplace with a much larger base of companies that are generally technology-related or technology-centric type firms. And those are the names that are going to start to be the drivers for our future in our industry, in our marketplace here. The challenge with that is that none of them, unlike Microsoft in the last cycle that in the course of 1 year came in and took 2 million square feet in downtown Bellevue and kind of, for those of us in the industry, bailed us out. None of these are going to come in and take 2 million square feet. They're all going to come in, one's going to take 50,000 feet, one's going to take 80,000 feet, one's going to take 40,000 feet. And so it's not going to grab the headlines, and it's not going to and it's not going to be quite as easy to kind of get your head around, do we have a stable investment market or do we have a vulnerable investment market? But I'm very confident that that is what will stabilize this marketplace in this cycle, that as that supply comes online, these are the companies that will come here and that are here that will grow. Seattle has been the beneficiary of another phenomenon, which is a bunch of new companies coming to Seattle that have never been here before, but they're not startups. They're major, large enterprises, predominantly out of Silicon Valley, and they've opened offices in Seattle, greater Seattle area, because they want to compete for the talent pool that exists here. So there's been 15 or so major Fortune 500 companies relocating out of Silicon Valley, opening an office in Seattle, and growing dramatically. Those 15 all went to Seattle. Not one of them came to Bellevue. And it's interesting, so you could get kind of worried about that. You could say, well, what's that about? The reality is Bellevue had no supply. So when they came here, Seattle had lots of supply, lots of vacancy, various buildings. Seattle started building buildings before Bellevue started building buildings. So Seattle had a place to put them. And then once one comes and two comes and three comes, it's the same, and generally they're all represented by the same handful of qualified real estate professionals. They go back to the same places. So I'm optimistic that when we start bringing more supply into Bellevue, we're going to start to be the next beneficiary for the next 5 companies that come into this marketplace. I also would argue that if you are one of those 15 companies in the last 3 years that has moved to Seattle, and you are competing against the other 50 companies that are already in Seattle and are tech related, and you're all clustered in a tight geographic area in Seattle, and you're all competing for each other's employees, the opportunity to come over to Bellevue and to essentially be a bigger fish in a smaller pond that has less competition but equal quality of talent, I think that's a pretty compelling story. And so I have a feeling that we're going to have 2 demand drivers coming into our marketplace. One, new groups moving here who have not come here previously, but are definitely coming to the greater Seattle area. That's the good news. It used to be when I was a broker, I'd go down to San Francisco and try to convince companies to move their offices here. And you'd use a lower cost of housing, and you'd use you'd lie that it didn't rain, and I mean, you do. But the reality was they didn't have an impetus to move here. They could have lots of talent. Stanford was churning out kids all the time, etc. Now it's all about recruitment. It's all about recruitment and retention. And they have all exhausted the California marketplaces, and they're global companies. And so there's nodes of concentrations of talent that they cannot afford not to be in competing for. And no one disputes that Seattle is one of those nodes now. So every major technology company, almost every major technology company in the country, is either opened an office or will be opening an office in Seattle or the greater Seattle area to compete for talent. I think Bellevue will be the beneficiary of that as we go forward. So that's the one thought. This is a slide showing you just the 3 buildings on the top, or the 3 buildings that are under construction right now, and then there's 3 additional buildings that are slated for development. If the 3 top buildings lease and are successful, it will then allow the 3 bottom buildings to be built, assuming the capital markets don't change. Remember, if Wall Street hits a hiccup and some other asset class becomes hot, this happened in a previous cycle. I remember literally like it was yesterday, venture capital just took off on us. And no one wanted to invest in commercial real estate. It wasn't sexy, it wasn't fun, it didn't have the returns of venture capital, and it just feels like a sucking sound of capital leaving the real estate marketplace. That's not a fun time to be in real estate at those moments. So hopefully we're able to, the demand comes that I'm confident will come, the supply will be able to follow right in line as that demand is here. All of these projects, I gotta tell you, you should be really proud of these projects from a local community perspective. They are everything you want. They're more sustainable than any buildings that have ever been built in Bellevue before. They're more attuned to the public, to the pedestrian, to the bike rider. They have more open spaces. They have fresher air. They're everything you would want in responsible development. And that's what's coming in downtown Bellevue. So I think the quality of the product is fantastic. I'm optimistic that the demand is going to be here through those 2 resources we talked about. And we just pray that the capital markets stay generally favorable to the greater Seattle area. And I think that we'll be in good shape. One last thing I wanted to mention. This is an interesting little phenomenon. I see people like Scotty Coombs and Gary, they live this every day. So I'm an old guy, I've been doing this for a long time. Forever and ever and ever, the rule of thumb was 250 square feet per person in an office space. If you were a company, for every 1,000 feet you leased, you'd have 4 people in it. And that was basically based on a model of a private office. Let's say the average office was 10 by 12. That's 120 square feet. So about 50% of the actual 250 was the space that you dedicated to every individual employee. And the other 50% of it was the common areas, the lunchroom, the conference rooms, the hallways, etc. Microsoft built millions and millions of square feet with offices as deep as you could, all the way through the building. There'd be 4 offices deep. Imagine if you're in the 4th row. You not only don't see light, I'm not sure how much air you even have back there in your deep room. Then cubicles became the popular thing. Everybody went to cubicles. Cubicles were going to be more open, etc. Call that an 8x8 cube, so 65 square feet. The average occupancy per employee went from about 250 to about 175 square feet per person, of which you were now dedicating roughly 70 square feet of that to the employee, and the balance was the common area. Now, benching is what is the new prototype for all the offices that are being built, for the most part, among these technology companies. What you own as an employee, at best, is you own that spot where your monitor is. You probably don't even have that as your spot, but you might have that, and that is giving you, on average, about 30 square feet per employee. The average occupancy, the average utilization is about gone from 250, 175, is down to about 100, 90 to 100, 105, call it 90 square feet, of which the dedicated employee is getting 30. So 60 of that is now back into common areas. And so if you walk through these companies today, It's essentially 3/4 common, open areas, lounge areas, chat areas, and what was the other one I heard recently? Like Kumbaya area or something. So, and the employee, it's been very interesting. So at a time where corporate America has flip-flopped, so the other thing I ask you to think about, for years and years and years, wherever the CEO lives, draw a circle around his house, and wherever the nearest office buildings are to that house is where that tenant's going to ultimately be located, because that's where the CEO lives, right? And he or she is going to make up their mind, and that's where the tenant's going to move to. And guys in this room have done it for years. That's what we used to do. It's completely the opposite now. When you go on tours now, I mean, when Gary goes on tours, he can't take his car. He has to rent these massive buses because senior leadership is scared out of their minds that if they move to a building that most of the employees don't like, they'll go across the street and work for a competitor, and they'll do it tomorrow. So it's all about keeping these employees happy, doing whatever they want to do. So the employee has all the power in the organization right now among these companies. Interestingly, the companies have found a way to take personal space away from the employee, give it back to them in shared spaces, and then employees have essentially endorsed this and said, yeah, I kind of like that. I think I'd rather have more shared space, interaction, communications, all that comes with that. And I don't need personal space. And I just think that's an interesting trend, completely different than we've ever experienced as old timers in the business. So anyway, those are just a couple of thoughts on the marketplace, and I'm happy to answer any questions or if there's any thoughts out there. Yes, sir.
Along those lines, is the lower density, as a landlord or investor, what's that do when you look at a building as far as the systems and the restrooms, and how does that affect?
It's brutal. I mean, it's terrible. We are building more restrooms in buildings that already have restrooms than I can tell you, and it's really challenging because every 1,000 feet of office space we have 8 people or 10 people instead of 4 people. So that means, and frankly, the ratio between women using the amount of space that a woman needs to use a restroom and the amount of space that a man needs to use a restroom is different. So I'm building more female stalls in restrooms in buildings everywhere I own because I got to keep up with this density, but my plumbing isn't set up for it, my drain lines aren't set up for it, my shear walls aren't set up for it, and so I am having to do these oddest configurations of restrooms you've ever seen, but that's what we need because of the space. Think of elevators. My elevators were sized for the average trip of the average number of occupants in an elevator being 4 people. Now I've got 7 people on an average trip on an average elevator. They feel small. So I'm ripping out ceilings. I can't make them wider, but I'm trying to make them feel better. I'm changing lighting in them. I'm, airflow in the buildings. I got to turn air over far more often than I used to have to turn it over before. But most of the buildings I own, someone else built. So I'm buying buildings that are 20 years old, but I've got to find ways to make them work in today's world. And it's a very interesting challenge, let's put it that way. And the buildings that are able to do it, I think, are where you'll find those companies go. And the buildings that can't do it or choose to ignore it will become obsolete. Yeah, Dwight.
When you're competing, Bill, for the decision to make an investment in a property, are you competing against other private equity firms? Are they domestic? Are they foreign? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So fundamentally, on most real estate acquisitions, you have 2 roles being played, 3 roles. You have a lender, no disrespect to Dwight, but I'll put that aside for a moment. And then you have the equity. And the equity usually comes in 2 parts. Essentially, the operator, the local, typically a local group who knows something about what they're doing, and they're actually the ones who are going to either transform the building or operate the building or do the things it takes to attract tenants and lease the buildings, et cetera. And the passive equity that are essentially allocators. So pension funds give their money to, I don't know who's in the room, but JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, I'll offend all of you. And Goldman Sachs is going to put $3 million into Seattle real estate. That allocation decision was made at some meeting on the 1st of January of some year. And they're going to put $3 billion into real estate in Seattle, and then they come into Seattle and they find guys like us, and they say, do you want to co-invest with us because you know how to operate buildings and we'll put money into buildings. So my challenge in life is when we look at opportunities in the marketplace, because we are putting our own money into all these acquisitions, we have to decide if we're comfortable buying it at what price and under what terms. So we make that decision first. Then we, open the phones up and let Goldman Sachs and all these others tell us what their money will cost us, their equity. I'll fund the other 50% bill with you, but I want an 8% return, and JP Morgan says I want a 7.5% return, et cetera, et cetera. So I shop equity, to answer your question, Dwight, but I can't, the equity pricing doesn't really change at the end of the day what I can or can't buy. And that equity, I didn't really answer your question, the equity is coming from all over the world. So when JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, XYZ company is aggregating that equity, there have, Blackstone, you read about in the paper all the time. You have massive funds that are bringing equity in from US pension funds, et cetera, sovereign wealth funds around the world. They're building big pools of money, and then they're allocating it across the world in slugs of billions of dollars at a time. And then there's guys like me who are underneath those slugs buying pieces of real estate. Yes, sir.
Bill, I guess just for kicks, I'd ask you to comment on the Expedia building. But my real question is also, I heard that Facebook took down some space in Bellevue. Rumor has it that they hired Frank Gehry, the architect, to design their space for them. And if you're aware of all that, would you care to comment on that, just for amusement?
Sure. So Facebook did hire Frank Gehry to do their interiors. It's in Seattle, though. They looked at both Bellevue and Seattle. They made a decision to stay in Seattle. They moved from the Met Park buildings to a building over on Dexter on the west side of Lake Union. Great example. They started in the marketplace 4 years ago in 22,000 feet, and they just leased 375,000 square feet in Seattle, and Frank Gehry is their architect. So they are one of 15 companies that are making this exponential leap in space year over year. DocuSign, there's a number of them. Alibaba is the one that a lot of people are talking about. I'll come back to Expedia, sorry. Alibaba is one that a lot of people are talking about right now. They came into Seattle. So Alibaba is an interesting scenario. They came in, they took down 10 to 20,000 feet in 3 markets in the country. This is a year and a half ago. And they said, we'll see, we're gonna put US headquarters somewhere. We'll see how these 3 markets work for us. And so they put Seattle, San Francisco, and one other market, I think New York. Now they're trying to make a decision based on the data they've gotten back as to which of those 3 markets they want to open their headquarters in. It's not going to be a massive headquarters day one. It'll be 100,000 feet probably day one, but given everyone else, it will likely grow significantly. Expedia's move to Seattle, to me, and this is just my personal opinion, that move, that decision was made at a very high level beyond the local leadership here. And I think I can see the rationale to that decision. You have an opportunity to buy 40 acres of waterfront in downtown Seattle. In the Seattle marketplace, you have the opportunity to buy 40 acres of waterfront corporate campus that's large enough to accommodate you for a large number of years, and you can buy it at a reasonably good price. I think that was the impetus behind the decision. All the fallout that will likely come with that, lack of people frustrated about commuting to Seattle, and why would I commute to Seattle? Maybe I'll just go across the street and work for somebody else and stay in Bellevue. That will be the fallout that may come. But unlike Kemper, who I think is optimistic, they may still stay. I'm not optimistic. I think they will be leaving. They will be leaving in 2018. So I think there's 500,000 square feet that's coming in the market in 2018 in that building. The interesting thing is when I showed you some of those names, there's a lot of those companies that are currently 100 to 200,000 feet, and they're scattered because they couldn't grow contiguous because of lack of space in Bellevue. So somebody's going to look at the Expedia building, someone's going to look at a lot of the new construction buildings, and it's not that they necessarily have a huge growth, it's I can consolidate 3 offices and scattered around Bellevue into one, and then I can be in a state-of-the-art building, and I think that might happen. And Microsoft, if you haven't heard, they announced today they're pulling back out of Bravern about 170,000 square feet. It's an online division. They're taking it back to campus. It's interesting, Microsoft took a large Kirkland operation recently back to campus as well, and while everyone talks about urbanization and everyone wants to be in the urban cores, which I fundamentally agree with, there's an example of a major corporate user who's chosen to take some people back onto their campus. I don't think it's a bigger harbinger for major problems, but it's an interesting decision. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Bill, very quickly, you talked about the densification in these buildings and, serving more employees. And you talked about building more bathrooms. How about parking? What happens with parking demand? Are you building more parking? Are you seeing more people utilizing transit or being forced to do so? Or what's happening on that side?
We have, in our buildings in the urban cores of Seattle and Bellevue, we've been fortunate because despite the densification, the utilization of transit and bicycles and the proximity of urban housing to the work, to the office, has essentially kind of made it neutral for us. So I can buy the same building in Seattle, I have 3 times more, or 50% more people in it, but I don't have to have 50% more parking in it. In the suburbs is where I'm having a problem, because in the suburbs, they don't have the benefits of all that, but they still have the densification going on. And so we are seeing challenges in some of our suburban offices where we're trying to, we're valet parking in a surface parking lot. And we're renting land elsewhere and running shuttles, things like that. Yes?
So where in your path, you've invested on the east side in a few different locations. Maybe tell us why you picked those different locations besides the one in Bellevue.
Sure. So we own Symetra Tower. We, up until last week, owned One Bellevue Center. We own Trulia Center in downtown Bellevue. We bought Belfield Office Park. And we went out and bought a large campus out in Issaquah recently that Microsoft occupies. 2 different strategies. So our basic MO is to feel that this desire to be in the urban core is very real, very strong, and very permanent. We don't think that's changing we don't think it's a trend. So you can buy in the urban core at one price. You can buy in the close-in urban core at another price. And you can buy out in the far suburbs at another price. And each time you have to decide, what am I giving up? Price is great, but if there's no demand, it doesn't really matter what you paid for it, it was a bad deal. So we're trying to find that sweet spot between, of those 3 environments, on a risk-adjusted basis, where can we do best? We could buy downtown and buy the most expensive building, but obviously our returns are going to be impacted. We can buy Belfield Office Park, which is close to downtown, and we can put some money into it and make some investments and see whether we can close the gap between our pricing and downtown. Or we can buy in Issaquah and have a huge spread and see whether we can entice people to come to Issaquah and do those kinds of things. So we're learning and we're experimenting in some respects with that. But we love Bellevue. We are big Bellevue fans. Anything else?
Is that the circle for your place?
Yeah, that's true. And I do live here, so.
Do you think Amazon will ever have an office on the east side?
I don't know. They're going to have, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know.
Okay.
There's so many things I don't know. Anything else? Well, thank you very much. It's been an honor. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Great timing, Steve. What keeps you up at night? Is there anything when you put on your look in your crystal ball that you see that could, are we getting into bubble creep a little bit with all of these really great things happening in this cycle? And you've seen some of these cycles over the course of a long career come and go, but what keeps
This
you up?
cycle over here, local supply, local demand, I feel like there's more transparency, visibility, and predictability to it. You can kind of get a sense as to how the environment is here and what's going on here. This cycle over here is the one that spooks the global capital market size, because if Greece defaults, if Hong Kong, if China does something, if there's a 9/11 event, equivalent event, Black Swan event somewhere in the country, those kinds of things could have huge and immediate implications on capital, cost of capital, availability of capital. And if I'm $50 million into a $100 million project and all of a sudden my capital gets cut off because I can't access it, that's a problem for me. So it's the stuff like that that keeps me up at night. This locally feels really good to us. Feels really good to us. Thank you very much.